Welcome back to Sociology Droids. Ready for a deep dive?
Always.
Today, Niklas Luhmann, his systems theory.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty complex stuff.
Not exactly a light read, but I think it's worth it. Super insightful, like once you really get Luhmann.
All right, so let's jump right in then.
Okay.
So Luhmann says society isn't made of people. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it sounds strange at first, but his idea is that society is all about communication. Like, it's a system of communication that just constantly creates and recreates itself. So think of it as this giant network of conversations and interactions and exchanges of information.
Okay.
And people. We're actually in the environment of that system.
Okay, so then what is the system made of? How can a system be closed off from people if people are the ones communicating?
Right, so that's where operational closure comes in.
Okay.
So Luhmann's saying that systems, even social systems, are closed off from their environment, at least in how they operate. They maintain themselves through self-reference. So they produce and reproduce their own elements.
So like a biological cell.
Exactly, like a cell that's constantly regenerating itself and maintaining those boundaries between itself and everything else. Right. You can even think about like your research project. You're always refining your ideas, gathering data, revising your arguments.
Yeah.
Your project has this internal logic, and it operates by its own rules. It's separate from like everything else going on outside of it.
I see, yeah. So, okay, society is a system. It's operationally closed. How does it function then? How does it keep going?
Well, Luhmann uses this idea of autopoiesis to explain it.
Auto what?
Autopoiesis. It means self-production. It comes from biology, actually.
Okay.
Living organisms are always like regenerating their cells, right?
Right.
Well, Luhmann says social systems do that too. They maintain themselves by creating and recreating their own elements.
So communication isn't just transmitting information.
Right.
It's actually creating something new. It's making meaning.
Yes, exactly. That's a key takeaway from Luhmann. He's not saying we just convey our thoughts to each other. He's saying that communicating is what makes meaning.
So it's like my research questions shape the data I collect, and then the data shapes how I understand things. It's a constant back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. And for Luhmann, society reproduces itself through communication more than anything else. It's how social structures stay the same and how they change.
So even though we aren't literally in the system,
right,
our communication is what drives it.
Exactly. And because society is self-referential, it uses communication to observe itself and create its own reality, it actually creates this blind spot. Yeah, the system can't actually see its own seeing.
Okay.
It's like try and look directly at your own eyes. You need a mirror, right?
Right.
Well, society needs things like sociologists, external observers to understand itself.
Oh, okay. So we're like mirrors reflecting back on society.
Yeah, exactly. And so if society is this communication system, how do we account for all its parts? How does it organize itself?
Yeah, good question. There are all sorts of institutions, groups, roles.
And that's where differentiation comes in. Luhmann says societies evolve by differentiating into more and more specialized systems.
So kind of like how cells become different organs and tissues.
Exactly. And Luhmann says there are several different types of differentiation that happen through history.
Okay.
There's segmentary differentiation, which is what you see in tribal societies, where groups are divided based on similarities.
Okay.
Then you have center-periphery differentiation, like in empires, where you have a powerful center and the dependent outskirt.
And then stratification, feudal societies,
Yep.
right? With those strict social classes.
Yes. But Luhmann argues that modern society is different. It uses something called functional differentiation.
Okay, so what makes functional differentiation different?
Well, in stratified societies, your social position was basically fixed. Like, you're born into a class and that's it.
Yeah.
With functional differentiation, though, individuals can belong to multiple systems.
So we're not just defined by one role.
Right. You might work in the economic system, participate in the political system, go to the doctor in the medical system. All is the same person.
So we're constantly switching between different roles.
Yeah.
Adapting to the codes of each system.
Exactly. And Luhmann says this is actually easier because society, in his view, isn't built around individuals.
It's like the system creates the space for us to have all these roles without being stuck in just one.
Precisely. And this is one way Luhmann helps us understand how complex modern society is.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but if modern society is divided into all these different functional systems, how do they work together? Seems like it would be chaotic, like everyone's speaking a different language.
That's a great question. It leads us to the next part of Luhmann's theory. Organizations. They act as translators between these different systems. But before we get into that, let's recap what we've covered so far.
Oh.
Okay, so where were we? Oh, right. Modern society, a whole bunch of specialized systems, each with its own, logic and way of working. But how do they all actually interact? How do we get a functioning society out of all that?
Yeah, exactly. Seems like it'd just be chaos if they're all in their own little bubbles, right?
Yeah.
Like, how can they exchange information or anything if they can't really communicate directly?
Right, and that's where organizations come in. Think of them as the bridges between these different systems. They're the translators, so to speak. They allow the systems to actually interact with their environments.
So, like, organizations are the diplomats. They smooth things over between all these different systems.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Like, say you're researching healthcare inequalities. You might partner with a hospital or a clinic, right?
Yeah.
Well, those organizations, they represent the healthcare system when they deal with other systems, like the legal system, the political system, even the economic system.
Okay, I see. So organizations let all these distant systems talk to each other, but without actually breaking that operational closure thing.
Exactly.
Okay. But where do people fit into all of this? I mean, we're always interacting with these systems, right?
Right.
But we're not really part of them, are we?
Right. And this is where Luhmann's idea of functional differentiation gets really interesting.
Okay.
It's not like, the older forms of society like stratification where people were just put into their social class and that was that.
Right.
With functional differentiation, you're not assigned to one specific subsystem. So you don't just belong to the legal system or the economic system or whatever.
So we're not just defined by one role.
Exactly. We interact with the systems through organizations and we participate in a bunch of systems at the same time. Like, think about your own life. You're a grad student in the academic system. Maybe you've got a part-time job. That's the economic system. You vote. That's the political system. All the same person.
It's like we're constantly code switching, We have to adapt to the rules of whichever system we're dealing with at that moment.
It reminds me of how differently I talk to, like, my professors versus my friends versus my family.
Exactly. And Luhmann would say that's actually easier because, remember, society for him, it's not built around individuals.
Right.
So by not being like a fundamental part of the system, we've got more flexibility to move around in this complex, differentiated world.
Exactly.
That's a pretty big shift in how we think about society, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so that's differentiation. But then how do these systems evolve? I mean, does Luhmann think it's just a straight line from, like, simple to complex societies? Not really. He's more interested in how systems adapt. Like how they change to deal with their environment and how they get more complex to solve problems. It's not about just getting bigger or more advanced. It's about finding new ways to organize, new ways to communicate, to meet those new challenges.
So evolution is more about adaptation and differentiation, not just progress.
Right. And for Luhmann, differentiation, it's like the main driver of evolution. As societies evolve, they differentiate into more and more specialized systems, and that makes them more complex, but it also creates new problems, problems of how to integrate everything, how to make sure everything still works together.
So it's this constant back and forth between differentiation and integration.
Exactly. And that's where communication media come in.
Okay.
They're really important for Luhmann's theory of evolution. They're like the glue that holds this increasingly differentiated society together.
Okay, so let's talk about these communication media then. We talked about, like, writing and printing, changing things, but how do they actually, like, shape the evolution of these really complex social systems?
Well, for Luhmann, communication media are more than just tools for passing along information.
Okay.
They actually shape how we communicate, how the whole structure of communication works, and how those social systems operate.
So it's not just about what you say, it's about how you say it.
Right. Think about it like this. Different media, they let us do different things. They let us communicate in different ways, and they limit us in different ways, too. Like face-to-face, you get immediate feedback. You can see someone's emotions, right? But with writing, you can be much more precise, and that information, it lasts longer, too.
Yeah, that's true.
So the way we communicate, it changes the kinds of social structures we can have.
Okay.
Like, take writing as an example. In societies without writing, knowledge was pretty much all passed down through stories, rituals, face-to-face conversations. And that limits how much information you can really share and how complex it can be and how well it's preserved.
It's all very, like, tied to a specific place and time, right?
Exactly. But writing, it changed all that. Now you could store and share knowledge across huge distances and over long periods of time.
Yeah.
So much more complex, more abstract knowledge could develop.
And that led to new forms of social organization too, right? Like bureaucracies, legal systems, big empires.
Exactly. Writing was crucial for all of that. You needed it to standardize laws, collect taxes, control a lot of territory.
Wow. So writing wasn't just about communication. It basically changed how society evolved. And the printing press, I imagine that had a similar effect, right?
Oh, absolutely. The printing press, it completely changed how knowledge was created and spread around. That contributed to, like, the rise of science, mass media, the modern nation state.
And now we've got electronic media, the internet, social media, all these digital technologies that are like changing everything, how we communicate, our relationships, everything about society.
Exactly. And this brings us to the big question. How are these new ways of communicating shaping how society evolves? What are they doing to us in the 21st century? We need to look at what they let us do, how they're affecting this functional differentiation, and whether they're solving problems or creating new ones.
It's all super interesting, but it's a lot to take in. How do we even start to understand all this complexity?
Well, Luhmann, he gives us some tools to work with.
Okay.
He says each way of communicating, each medium, works with a specific code. That code shapes how information gets processed, how meaning is created. To really dig into how these different media change how social systems evolve, we need to understand those codes. But before we get into that, maybe let's take a second to let all this sink in.
All right, yeah, let's dig into those codes then. I'm really curious about this, like how these codes help us understand how media shapes society.
Okay, so Luhmann says each communication medium has this binary code.
Okay.
And it determines how it filters information, how it makes meaning. So let's start with language, right? Like that's the most basic way we communicate. What do you think the code for language is?
Well, I guess language is about conveying information, making statements about the world. So true, false.
Exactly. Every time we say something, it's like implicitly being judged as true or false.
Right.
And this simple code actually lets language create so much complexity. We can make distinctions, build arguments, create these whole systems of meaning.
It's amazing how much comes from just that one binary.
Yeah, it really is. So then there's writing. What do you think writing adds? What new code does it bring in?
Well, with writing, you're not just dealing with spoken words anymore. It's a record. So I'd say written oral.
Exactly. Writing creates this fundamental difference between what's fixed, written down, and what's just spoken, which is temporary.
Right.
And that changes how knowledge works, how it's organized, stored, shared.
Yeah.
Written stuff, you can analyze it, critique it, spread it around in ways you just can't do with like oral traditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that shift from oral to written, it's really important for how we got more complex, abstract knowledge. Like philosophy, law, science.
Absolutely. Okay, so then we get to printing. What's the new code there?
Well, printing takes writing and makes it like mass production, right? You get tons of copy. So original copy.
Right. Again, printing makes us distinguish between that first original text and all the copies.
Okay.
And that changes how accessible knowledge is, how quickly ideas can spread. It's part of why we have literacy, the Reformation, the scientific revolution.
So again, a technology, a change in how we communicate, and boom, society's wholly different.
Right. And then building on printing, you have mass media. What do you think their code is?
Mass media, it's about choosing what to tell a huge audience.
Yeah.
Right? So news, not news.
Exactly. The media is always deciding what's important, what people should pay attention to.
Right.
And that has a huge effect on public opinion, on how people see the world.
It's like they're creating our reality, in a way, by choosing what stories to tell.
Exactly. Okay, last one. Electronic media. What's the code here?
Well, with digital stuff, it's all about networks, right? So inclusion, exclusion.
You got it. Electronic media are constantly deciding what to include, what to keep out.
Okay.
Think about those algorithms on social media or search results.
Yeah.
They decide what we see, what we don't see, and that shapes, like, our digital world.
It's like a new kind of gatekeeping. But on a huge scale, and we don't even always realize it's happening.
Exactly, and that's why understanding these codes is so important. If we want to get how electronic media are changing communication, relationships, society as a whole, this is where we have to start.
Wow. This has been, I don't know, like mind-blowing. Luhmann's theory, It's definitely made me rethink some things, especially about how these different ways of communicating, they're really what shapes society.
Yeah, Luhmann is, he's not always easy to follow, but he gives us a really powerful way to understand how modern society works. So keep asking those questions, keep exploring, keep using that sociological imagination.
On that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Luhmann. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Sociology Droids for another fascinating exploration.